Hey guys, what's up? It's Public, back with the first video of Shadowlands that I've done. I know it's been a long time since I made a video, but I figured with the new expansion, it's time to bring back a video form of content just to give you guys kind of like a informational series on how Shadow's doing inside of Shadowlands, how Priest is doing in general, and just in what feedback I can give to Blizzard, and also just let the community know what's happening. So in this video, we're going to go over lots of different things related to Shadow Priest in Shadowlands. First things first, just going to quick overview of how the spec stands right now. Keep in mind this is at the time of recording, so things might be updated later on. Just keep that in mind. I will put something in the description if it does change, but we'll go over the overview. And then after that, honestly, I'm just going to do a quick, initial thoughts on the spec and how it stands now. Just kind of various thoughts. And then I'm going to go into a very long laundry list of problems that the spec currently has, both things that we've covered on posts on the forums and other way. So we'll do that after that. And then lastly, I'm just going to go over quickly things I'd like to see for Shadow. It's never going to be perfect. They're never going to do everything that I say, but just like to give some ideas of what to fix going forward. So without further ado, let's see what's changed. Okay, so let's get started with going over the spell changes and general changes for Shadow Priest inside of Shadowlands. We kind of go through these kind of quick, but you'll be able to see the list of changes in the description below. There's a Wowhead link that I'll give in there. They do a great job just kind of going over what's changed, and I'm sure they'll add the new stuff as things progress. So first things first, we did get several new spells added to our baseline toolkit in Shadowlands. Some of these guys are just for Shadow Priest, others are for all specs. So we are getting Devouring Plague back as a new dot. I guess new dot, it's an old dot that's kind of been reinvented. It costs insanity, does some damage. It's a weird spell. We're going to talk about that in a bit, but just know we have a new dot now. Shadow Death is making a return baseline into the toolkit. It's no longer a talent. It's a little different than that talent was and is in its current state, but we'll talk about that in a second. And then we also get Desperate Prayer baseline into the spec. I guess, another set of healing spells that we have, which is cool. I'm not going to complain. They also rock back Mind Soothe, which is an old spell from the game that just reduces the range that enemies can attack you. And then again, kind of another spell returning from the Legion era. We get Power Infusion back baseline. So real quick, Power Infusion is kind of interesting. It isn't, again, totally similar to what we had before. You can now cast Power Infusion on yourself or another ally, which seems a little, I guess, degenerate, for lack of a better word, to say that, you might want to give it to someone else in your raid team, this ability. There's even been a data mine legendary that, when you cast Power Infusion on an ally, you also get it. So they're definitely kind of whole hog into Power Infusion right now. Just one quick note, it does not give you Insanity. It's just a haste buff. So this is a little different than what we've had previously, but more to come on that. And as I mentioned before, we did get a few talent changes just because of how the new spells have been added. So we have Death and Madness is a new talent in the game. This is replacing where Shadow Word Death was before. And then we also get a little bit of a tweak to Surrender to Madness. Now, again, Surrender to Madness keeps going through the iterations, and unfortunately, this round is still kind of weird, or kind of misses the mark a little bit, in my opinion. You gain... It's basically like they combine Dark Ascension into the ability. So when you use Surrender to Madness, you go into Voidform, you get that 100 Insanity. And then, same as always for the next 25 seconds, you generate 100% more Insanity, and then, you can cast while moving, right? That part's the same. Now, what's different here is that if the target does not die that you've actually cast it on, then you'd actually die. You die. This is similar to Legion, right? So it's not a case of, I get, I think was it 90% of your health or whatever. Your character just dies. Now, the weird part about this is actually like a debuff that you put on a target. And if that target does die, then not only do you succumb, or you don't succumb to Surrender to Madness, but you also lose the buff. So it's kind of like a weird interaction of do I use it on a mob and then, instantly kind of fall out? Or what's the purpose of this? It's kind of like a weird, they're trying to make it like bursty or something on a mob, but it doesn't quite work out that way because Voidform just doesn't do that. So again, we'll talk about that more in just a bit. So that's all we currently have as far as changes to the spec. Nothing crazy or substantial. Otherwise, we still have Voidform, right? They haven't totally redesigned the spec or anything. You still play Shadow the same way that you more or less do today. It's just now you have more buttons to fit into your rotation. Okay, so I've kind of gone over very, very quickly, the changes they've done in the spec. I just want to kind of iterate very briefly that I think most of these changes as a whole put the spec in a negative light, in my opinion. I think they're more or less bad changes to the spec. I think, while Shadow has its flaws right now, I think it's still one of the most fun range classes to play right now in BFA. Sure, it could be better. Is it as fun as Legion was? I mean, kind of depends, right? But it's a good spec. It's got a good base. It just needed some tweaking to kind of fill in the gaps where it just didn't feel fun to play. And I don't think many of these buttons really solve that problem for me. I think, because Power Infusion doesn't give Insanity generation, because Devouring Plague is like fighting with Voidform, it definitely kind of feels like these changes were made in kind of a black box of someone that doesn't necessarily play Shadow or totally understand what it means to play Shadow in like a PvE rating scenario or even Mythic Plus scenario. Yeah, it hasn't put a great taste in my mouth about the spec. I'd love for Blizzard to kind of hit the reset button a little bit and be like, okay, well, Devouring Plague didn't quite hit the mark. Let's revert that and start working on the core, like, fundamental issue with the spec rather than kind of introducing these new problems. They've added things to the spec like Shadow or Death baseline, but they haven't really given it enough meat and potatoes to really make it fun to press all the time, or even in a specific scenario. It can actually be, actually hurt your character too much if you press it. So I think they need to balance out really what they want to accomplish here. If they want to invest into Voidform or get rid of it, I think it could work either way. But for starters, we got to fix the problems that they introduced here, mainly the general Voidform problem, and then Devouring Plague kind of playing into that. So yeah, initial thoughts, guys. It's not great. It's not my favorite thing to play in the game. I think especially at low-level haste that we have on Alpha, it plays really, really slow, and these changes don't help with any of that. And, I'm sure it'll be okay if you get enough haste, but some of these changes rotationally just make the spec so much less fun for me. I hope they do some things to change this stuff. Okay, so now I want to spend kind of the majority of this video kind of like deep diving into each one of these problems that I mentioned specifically to kind of say, here's what's wrong with it, here's why it doesn't work, and here's why I don't like it. Just note, if you want a bit more like specifics on any of these topics, I've linked lots of forum posts that we've made in the description that kind of go over, even in some math scenarios, like why this actually doesn't work. So if you want more detail, check that out. So first things first, Devouring Plague. I've mentioned this briefly already in this video, but giving us an Insanity spender in Devouring Plague. Remember, it does cost 50 Insanity to use this spell for very little gain. I know it's alpha, so numbers are kind of wonky, but it just doesn't do enough damage for costing 50 Insanity. Basically, if you think about it next to Voidform and specifically Void Eruption and Void Bolt, Void Eruption's an AoE ability that, is around a radius of your target, and then Void Bolt just hammers one target with single target damage and refreshes your dots. When you stack up that, which is effectively what you're giving up by pressing Devouring Plague, even if you hit Devouring Plague on 2 enemies, it's just not doing enough damage to make it worth it, right? And especially if you consider, Blizzard was kind of intending this to be a burst ability, but the initial damage, again, doesn't hit for that much. And then it's like, I think, a 12-second dot right now. If you think about a 12-second, window, it would have been better to, say, use 3 seconds of that window to build up to Voidform, which you would have had to do anyway if you were if you need the Devouring Plague Insanity, and probably longer than 3 seconds in reality. So you cast Void Eruption, then you Void Bolt everything, keep your dots up, and then Mind Seer. Like 9 times out of 10, it's always gonna be more damage. If you have 2 targets, maybe it works out, but in the end, if the fight's long enough, Voidform's always gonna win. And when I say long enough, that's like, I don't know, 15 seconds or even shorter, right? So they either need to make Devouring Plague actually hit harder, and have an AoE component to compete with Void Eruption, or something else entirely. The fact that it costs Insanity just makes this it's just not worth it. It doesn't make any sense. Costing 50 Insanity is just way, way, way too much for what it's doing. Honestly, I think the spell just creates so many problems. They should just remove it. It doesn't accomplish anything that we need. It doesn't fill in any gaps that we have. It's just creating more problems than it solves. Especially when you think about every single one of our talents and spells in the game, more or less, is there to either get you into Voidform faster or keep you in Voidform longer. So this talent basically goes against all of that. So yeah, baseline spell, right? It's not even a talent. It needs to go away. Just get rid of it. Okay, so next thing is Shadow or Death. I think this spell is okay. It's headed in the right direction. they keep doing some weird things with it that kind of throw me off a bit. I think what we had in Legion was fine. Even the talent that we currently have today in BFA is fine. I don't really know why they're trying to kind of reinvent the wheel here. They're making it like you can use the spell at all target percent health, but that doesn't mean you should or they want you to. So like, for example, it doesn't really give insanity right now unless you take the talent, which, we'll get into in a second. The fact that you used a GCD ability that doesn't give insanity just kind of boggles my mind. Like, you're effectively throwing away a few stacks of Voidform, sometimes even more at the higher end to cast this ability, and that never feels good to press. So for right now, until they fix the insanity generation at least, it's just not something I'd like to use personally, but it's baseline, so we got to use it. The second thing is that it does a lot of damage to you, especially when it crits. Currently on alpha, the iteration that we have is when your target is below 20% health, it deals more damage, which then the damage component of Shadow Word Death, whatever damage it does, you deal to yourself. That infinitely scales with how hard you hit your target. So, imagine you get a big crit or the boss has like a vulnerability phase or whatever. You're basically just smacking yourself super hard. When I was testing this on alpha, I was easily able to chunk my health to almost, 40-50%. So yeah, it's kind of a mess right now of what they wanted to do. Personally, I think they should either make it only usable within 20% and then back off the damage component, or back off the damage component enough to where it makes sense to only use it below 20%. But if you want to use it above, it's okay. It's just not the end of the world, right? If they want to give us an execute ability, just make it an execute ability, in my opinion. I know there are some PvP use cases for not doing that, but honestly, they just need to pick what they want the spell to do and just roll with it. Right now, it's just kind of all over the place. And then just real quickly, I have to mention this. This is terrible. Blizzard, I think in their kind of, they made Mind Blast baseline for all pre-specs in the game. And in doing so, I think they were intending to rework the cooldown a bit. For some reason, they made it a half second longer than it is currently, which basically throws off the entire synchronization we have with the Mind Blast cooldown, RGCD, and the other spells that we're pressing. So it leads to this like weird, awkward gap randomly in our rotation. It just makes no sense at all. This just feels like a mathematical oversight on their part. Please fix this. It's not fun to play with. Even if the rest of these things get away, if they fix this, at least Mind Blast will be fixed again, which is good. And then, this one everyone's kind of been hampering on, and the forums have gone crazy with like, let's just remove Voidform. It's not working, whatever. I think there is a good chunk of that is true. And I think part of that's because, in Shadowlands, there's no incentive or real big incentive, in my opinion, to stay in Voidform longer, right? So currently in BFA, we get a large amount of critical strike after Voidform with the Chorus of Insanity Azerite trait, which kind of gives us a very, very large incentive to get high stacks of Voidform and then burst afterwards. Even though that kind of playstyle has its flaws, has some problems, it at least gives you some motivation, some like real DPS motivation to stay in Voidform longer. In Shadowlands, Chorus of Insanity, of course, doesn't exist. Nothing exists like that. So the only incentive to stay in Voidform longer right now is access to Voidbolt and haste. Don't get me wrong, it's something. It's just not exciting, right? Like, it doesn't make me want to like crave to get higher stacks other than it's just a higher number. And I think that's the kind of point here. It's not that it necessarily isn't or isn't strong. It's just not fun or exciting, right? Like, at least when I push stacks in Legion or in BFA, I got a really big reward for doing that. And now, not so much. I get some more haste. Great. That makes my class actually playable at high haste. So they need to give Voidform a reason to live, in my opinion, or they should just get rid of it, right? Pick one of the two. It doesn't really matter, but in the way it is now, it just doesn't work. So, okay. And then last but not least, I had to cover the talent tree for Shadow Priest. It's just totally all over the place right now. I think parts of it I like a lot, parts of it I don't. Specifically there's problems with a few of the tiers, right? Like, for example, the first row with Shadowed Void in it. Shadowed Void is still not baseline for some reason, so unfortunately that means that we still have to take this talent if we want the rotation to be fluid again. Again, this just needs to be baseline, right? Playing Shadow without 2 charges of Mind Blast baseline, getting that gap back in is super important, right? Otherwise, you're just going to be sitting there channeling Mind Flay, being super bored, and it leads to just in general making the spec more punishing than it needs to be. And frankly, the other two options in this row just don't make any sense. They're not fun to play with, right? So why do we have them? All in all, the level 25 row, fine. 30 row, fine. 35 row, I do want to quickly call out Mind Bomb needs to stun again. The fact that they remove that is just so sad. It hurts my heart so much. Just about every class in the game has some type of AoE stun now. Not just about, a lot of the big ones do. And some of them aren't as vanilla as press button AoE stun. Some of them do have consequences like it takes down, you cast it on a target, whatever. I think they need to put this back in the game. I think it makes sense from a Mythic Plus perspective. Please put this back. And then just real quickly, the level 40 row, it's okay. Death and Madness feels weird. If you haven't seen it before, I'll put this up real quick. So if a target dies within 6 seconds after being struck with Shadow or Death, you gain 40 insanity over 4 seconds, which is kind of weird to think about, but it's still insanity, so it's fine. I think the weirdest part about this thing is it probably, baseline, this gives Shadow or Death insanity, which I feel like it should have anyway. So the fact that we need to take a talent to really make Shadow or Death fully make sense just doesn't make, I don't like that at all. So I kind of covered earlier what this should be, or what Shadow or Death should be. I think they should probably just delete this talent if they fix Shadow or Death like it should. And then the level 45 row with Lingering Insanity, Mindbender, and Void Torrent. This is just a numbers tuning problem for the most part. Playing without Lingering Insanity just almost never makes sense mathematically, unless they nerf it to the ground, which then we just take Mindbender usually. I think they really need to rethink this talent row. It just generally doesn't make sense. And then last but not least, the level 50 row. Again, another talent row that's kind of set it and forget it. Taking Legacy of the Void with that 5% damage increase and the access to Void Eruption sooner just always makes sense. It's always going to be good no matter what content you're doing. Sure, Dark Ascension could have its moments. It could be okay. But you lose the 5% from Legacy of the Void, and it's almost never going to make that up. And, last but not least, Surrender to Madness, I think should probably just get deleted from the game. Generally speaking, it causes more problems than it ever solves. I think its current iteration is probably one of the worst things that we ever seen from Surrender to Madness. It's hard to really see it right now because it is kind of buggy in my testing on alpha, but I think in general it's not worth the pitfalls of the talent. So there you go. All right, so I've been rambling on for a very long time now, so I'm going to kind of cut this a bit short. So here's the TLDR for what I think needs to be done to Shadow to really get it in a better spot than what it is now. I think, first things first, they need to fix the Voidform problem. Either give Voidform a reason to exist, give you a reason to want to push stacks, or just remove Voidform and change how the spec works. I think if they can't make it work, we need something different. I don't really know what that is. Maybe it's Shadow Wars, we need something else entirely, but leaving it with nothing just makes it super feels bad and just makes you wish it used to play the way it did before. So give us something kind of incentive, right? Second thing is utility options, right? You don't see a lot of Shadow Priest in Mythic Plus. Part of that reason is because of our utility. Generally speaking, our damage is usually pretty okay, but the utility is really where we lack. We have a very long interrupt, even with the talent. We have a Mass Dispel. There's not a whole lot of things to use it on, although maybe in the next season they're considering making Bursting dispellable, which would be a cool change if they leave that in. But we have no AoE stun anymore. We don't have a grip or anything crazy like that. We have a life grip for an ally, but that's hardly super useful. And I think when you stack up Shadow Priest to other range specs in the game, it's kind of oh yeah, they don't bring a lust or an immunity or whatever. Why would I bring them? And I think Shadow needs some kind of utility to be yes, I want to invite this Shadow Priest to my group. I want that for my group. They'll bring something to this key. And I think we need something there in Shadowlands. The next thing I think we need is talent fixes, right? I think some talents should just straight up be baseline, mainly Shadow Word Void. And I think they should seriously consider whether or not they want certain talents to exist, namely Surrender to Madness, Death and Madness. Other things like Lingering Insanity or Legacy of the Void should either become baseline because we always pick them, or they should just get removed. I think something like that needs to happen. Otherwise, we're never going to have a good choice in our talent row, and it's just going to be static all the time. And I think not having those options really limits the spec's viability in a lot of different kinds of content. So, and then last but not least, please fix the haste problems with Shadow. I'm sure in a lot of the footage you've seen behind me, it probably looks a little slow. It's because I'm playing on alpha. I don't have a lot of gear, but I think this really, really highlights a key problem for Shadow is that playing Shadow without gear specifically without haste in your gear, it feels so slow and sluggish. I think this is not iterated any better than if I go to any melee class in the game with no gear right now in Shadowlands, the pacing of those specs feels so good and right. And then I go to a ranged spec in the game, especially Shadow Priest, and it just feels like I'm waiting so much for my spells to come off cooldown or whatever it is, and playing with that low haste is just not fun. So if they can fix that some way, I think that'd be great. So, and guys, that is it. I'm done with my rant. That's my feedback for now. Please, if you haven't, go check out the forum post that I've linked in the description. Give them a heart or an upvote, whatever it's called in Blizzard forum world. Add your own feedback there if you have your thoughts and you're testing on alpha. If you haven't tested on alpha or you don't have alpha, don't worry. There's more stuff coming. Post on the generic forums, whatever you have to do. Give Blizzard feedback. The most feedback we can give them, the better. Just be cordial. They're trying. I know it might seem like they're not sometimes, but I have faith that they're going to fix this. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Discord. I don't have a whole lot of time to answer messages, but I will get to them as soon as I can. All right, guys. Thanks for watching.